My name is Helen Litton. I'm a great niece of Commandant Edward Daly, who commanded the Four Courts, and of Kathleen Daly Clark, his sister, who married Tom Clark. I've written a biography of Edward Daly and a biography of Tom Clark for the O'Brien Press series 16 Lives. I've been very impressed with the commemorations this year because it brought home to me the extent to which it is part of the country's history and really important. I mean, when I was growing up, it was kind of in the background. My father came from Limerick, but he came to live in Dublin. So it was only when I went down to Limerick and talked with my grandparents down there that I really heard anything much about it. And not even much then, because people who'd lived through it didn't really talk much about it. But the Limerick bungalow contained huge portraits of Tom Clark and Ned Daly, and it was clearly an important part of the family's history. But very much the background, and then when we were growing up, what with the Northern Ireland Troubles and so on, even commemoration of 1916 by the state more or less ceased for a while. People were very wary about paying attention to it because of the risk of the IRA taking over it. And so it's really only come into focus now with all of this stuff going on. I remember driving through Ballyfermot and seeing a picture of Ned Daly up on a lamppost, and thinking, that's my great-uncle, and that's the family member, and then thinking, but he belongs to the country, he doesn't belong just to the family. That really is a historic person in the history of the state. And it never really quite struck me before. To an extent, my mother, because she's a pacifist, strong pacifist, and would never have any truck with anything that involved physical violence. And I was pretty much reared in that belief that physical violence is always wrong and that can never be a reason for it, and that it only causes suffering and so on. And I find it hard to shake that off and to try and look at it in a different way, and to see that sometimes, however dreadful it is, violence does change things. But in the context of today with terrorism and suicide bombings and so on, it's very hard to speak for the use of violence in any context, because the consequences are always far broader than perhaps the perpetrators might think. I've no doubt that the men and the women who went out in the Easter Rising were brave, believed what they were doing, they were committed to what they were doing, they were willing to sacrifice their lives. But there was a lot of collateral damage to other lives as well, and to the city centre and to businesses, to Ireland's economy. Ultimately, it led to the Free State. So it's difficult. I mean, the French lived through the Revolution and the Terror. These were dreadful years, but they commemorate their revolution every year just the same. And they don't hide it or try and forget it or try and excuse it or explain it away. They say this happened. There were dreadful years, but in the long run, France was the better for it, and that needed to be done. I was wondering how it was going to be this year, because I remember the 1966 commemorations quite well. It was just the year after I left school, and I went to various, there was a big pageant in Croke Park, and I was at the parade, and my grandfather came up from Limerick for all of that, because he was one of the people who was sitting on the stands with his medals out there, and very pleased with it. And in fact, it was the first time we'd ever heard my grandfather really talk about his time in the 1st Battalion as a captain, and a bit about the War of Independence as well. And even my father had not heard him talk like that before, but somehow the commemoration in '66 gave him the permission to really talk about it. Though, being as the kind of man he was, and as I think was very common for many of them, he told you the funny incidents, he didn't dwell much on what must have been really darker parts of it as well. And the 66 commemorations were as they were because most of the survivors, there were a lot of survivors around. They'd all been very young in 16, so by 66 they were still in their 70s or 80s, and they were still there. So the state could not have commemorated it, I think, any other way than to say, this is a wonderful thing, we're very proud of you, here are medals, congratulations. And we can take a slightly more nuanced view of it now because it's 100 years. And in a way, we're coming to terms with it. We're actually looking at it, the good and the bad, the bravery and the cowardice and the deaths of civilians, including children, the collateral damage as well, which is very much all overlooked in 1966. And I think it has been commemorated extremely well. Any of the ceremonies I've been at, everything's been done so well. I think it was a brilliant idea to send the flag and the proclamation around to every school. I've been visiting a few schools, and the kids are so engaged, they're so interested in it. And I think it has provided a very good opportunity to look at the proclamation again, which is a very important document which we've kind of forgotten about. And now people are rereading it. And obviously bits of it are dated, bits of it you wouldn't repeat. But most of it, it talks about equality, and that is the most important part of it. And I think we could have that read every year and have a proclamation day or an Independence Day. I think it would be a very good thing. Much more intent on inclusiveness, on bringing everyone in, people who agreed with it, people who didn't, as well as commemorations for the soldiers who died, the British soldiers who died. At the Glasnevin wall there, that was put up in the cemetery. I think that's an excellent idea, although I know there's been a lot of complaint. I think we've just worked harder at trying to look at it properly and look at it in an international sense as well, in its international context, and how, to some extent, how it affected other countries, because quite a few countries looked to the Easter Rising, such as India, and other countries that were trying to break from an imperial yoke did look to the Easter Rising as showing that it actually could be done, not perhaps exactly the way it was done, but that it was possible for a country to come out from under an imperial control. And Ireland was the first to come out from British control, apart obviously from the American colonies sometime previously. But we were the first in the modern era to do that. And it wasn't exactly peaceful, but it was less brutal and bloody than it need have been. In the end, it was a matter of discussion and diplomatic contact and compromise, and it worked step by step like that. But 1916 was the first step. I think in the long run we're all dead. It is 100 years ago, and death is the great leveller. Nobody can change your life after you're dead, or change anything you did or didn't do. Whether you remember it or not doesn't change your life. The Glasnevin wall, people complained that the names of soldiers were up there as well as of the volunteers and so on, but it seemed to me that words on a wall aren't going to change anything my family did. You cannot demean it or deface it or diminish it. And if the words on the wall give a comfort to some family somewhere else, I think that's absolutely fine. I find myself wondering what's going to be like in 20 months. Do you know what I mean? I think this was the big one, and I think it will now perhaps take its place in history, not as something to be ashamed of or forgotten, not as something to be celebrated gloriously as an absolutely the only thing that ever mattered in Irish history either, but just will take its place in historical record, and we will look back on it, but without passion is perhaps not the right word to say it, but being able to assess it more calmly. And from now on, I dare say it will be commemorated every Easter, but it will be at a particular level. But it will be settled. It will be settled that this was an important part of our history, that it must be commemorated, that it doesn't matter what's going on anywhere else, it deserves to. And the people who fought in it, and particularly the executed men, deserve to be remembered every year. From a family point of view, the most moving was the hour in Kilmainham on the centenary of Edward Daly's death. There was just myself and a cousin of my father's who was 87. She came up from Limerick. She came up for everything. She wasn't going to miss it, but she was the only one of that generation who was still able to travel, though there are 4 still alive. So the 2 of us were there, and we laid a wreath. And the army did a splendid job, as they always do, and Minister Riley gave a speech, and you had the last post, you had the flag, you had the band playing. And for just 2 people standing in the Stonebreakers yard, it's very, very moving.